Hello, my name is Kerry and I work at Suntrap Forest Centre, which is the environmental education centre for the London Borough of Waltham Forest. And today I want to talk to you about street trees. I'm lucky enough to work in this amazing forest called Epping Forest, which is in northeast London. And these are the typical trees that I might see every day when I go to work. But for most of us, actually, we live in towns or cities. And can you think of any large trees that grow in your street, your garden, or maybe a nearby park? And today I want to talk to you about how to identify these street trees, why they are so important. I'm hoping that you might learn how to estimate the tree's age and how much carbon it stores, and what you can do to help look after and protect these amazing street trees. The first thing is how to identify a tree. The first thing to do is to look and see, is it a deciduous, that is a tree that drops its leaves in the autumn, or an evergreen tree? And you can usually tell by the shape. Is it a lollipop tree, or perhaps one that looks like one of the ones we might bring into our houses at Christmas? Does it have fruit on it? And by fruit, it might mean nuts or catkins. They're the ones that are in little bunches and hang down from the tree, and very often they'll float down on the wind. Does it have berries? Or maybe your tree near you has some apples or other fruit growing on it. Does it flower? And if so, what time of year? Does it have very colourful flowers? Or perhaps it's a tree that is pollinated by the wind, and so its flowers are inconspicuous. You might not even notice them on the tree. Look at the leaf shape. Is it a broadleaf tree, one of those deciduous ones again, where its leaves are either simple or compound? A simple leaf is one that just has one leaf growing on a stalk. A compound leaf has a stalk with lots of little leaflets on it. Or is it a conifer? Again, remember the Christmas tree shaped tree? It might have needles on it. And what colour and texture and shape is the leaf? And particularly look at the edges of the leaf. Some of them have what we call serrated edges, little jagged edges, and that might help you to identify it. The bark is another good way to identify your tree. Look at the pattern and the colour of it and its texture. Once you've seen how to identify your tree, it might be that you use one of these, an identification key. You might have seen these type of things at school. These ask questions for which the answer can only be a yes or a no, and you work your way through the key. So for example, if you have a leaf and it is what's called a simple leaf, you would go along the yes side. And then you'd need to look at the edges of your leaf to see if they were serrated or not. If they were, then it may well be a silver birch tree. And this particular ID key is for the most common urban trees. Have a good look at it, because we're going to have a go at identifying some of the trees that you might find near you. Here's our first tree to try, and here's its leaf. It's a simple leaf, not a compound one, but notice the shape of it. It's almost like three triangles put together, and it might even remind you of the flag of Canada. Here are the fruits of the tree, which are spiky balls that hang down and occasionally do fall down onto the street below. And here's the bark of this particular tree. It's quite scaly, and these scales can drop from the tree and sort of end up at the bottom amongst the roots. If you live in London, you may well recognise this tree, as it's a London plane. And there are thousands and thousands of these trees all around London, which can grow to a massive, massive size. Are you ready for the next one? There's the leaf. Again, it's a simple leaf, not dissimilar to our previous one, except this time it's got 5 sort of spikes to it. Here's the fruit of the tree. You may well call it a helicopter. It's one of those seeds that drops and spins down before it reaches the ground. I'm sure you'll have seen it before. Here's the bark. Do you know what it is yet? This one is a sycamore. Neither the London plane nor the sycamore are what are known as native trees. That is, trees that have been here in this country since the last ice age. They've been introduced from other countries. However, this is one of our local native trees, and those leaves are what are called lobed leaves. See the edges? They're sort of lumpy and bumpy. When you see the seed of this tree, or the fruit, I'm sure you'll recognise it. That's right, it's an acorn. Can you remember the name of the tree that the acorn grows on? Here's its bark. Very characteristic, very rough, cracked, with deep fissures in it. I'm sure you've probably got it by now. It's the oak tree. One of our 5 most common trees that are found on long streets in this country. Our next tree is also a native tree to the UK. Here's its leaf. It's quite a small leaf, sort of triangular, and look at those edges. This is what we mean by serrated. You see those little jagged edges. And here's the seed from the tree. This is called a catkin. It's a group of seeds held together. And what happens with these is that they disintegrate and fall apart in the autumn, and the tiny little seeds are blown all around looking for a new place to start to grow. When you see the bark of this tree, it may well give it away. It's white and it's papery, and it's very easily peeled off. Many schools have these trees in their grounds as they don't grow quite as large as some of the other ones. It's a silver birch. I'm sure you recognise it. And our final most common tree that we find on our streets in this country is this one. Notice the leaf. This is a compound leaf. And this particular compound leaf is made up of 5 smaller leaflets, almost like the shape of a hand. And so leaves in this shape are called palmate, looking like the palm of your hand. Once you see the seeds from this one, I'm sure you'll recognise it. Yes, I'm sure you've got it by now, but there is the bark anyway. It's the horse chestnut, and I'm sure you know it as a conker tree, and that's because obviously the seeds are called conkers. Now that you've had a go at identifying our 5 most common street trees, I want us to think about why they're important. One of the most important things is that trees, like all green plants, produce oxygen, which is pretty important as that's what we need to breathe. They also provide shade, and they release what's called water vapour, that's water as a gas, into the air. And both of these things obviously cool the air down. Very important in a city in the summertime. If you've ever walked along a city street on a very, very hot summer's day and then end up under the shade of a tree, you'll know how much cooler it feels. And trees in cities can help to reduce the temperature by as much as 8 degrees. They can remove pollutants and toxins from the air. As we drive around our cities, unfortunately, lots of tiny little particles end up in the air, and these we can breathe in, and they're not very good for us. Trees help to remove some of those. The London plane is a really good example of a tree that can reduce the pollutants in the air. Trees can help to protect us from flooding, as they absorb so much water through their roots. They obviously can provide food, both for people and for wildlife. You might have a local tree where you can take the fruit in the autumn. They provide a habitat for many animal species, like a shelter for them. This is just as important in a city as it is in any other place. And trees are good for our mental well-being. It has been found that patients in hospitals recover better just because they have a view of a tree from their window. So they must be good for us. And here's another reason why trees are so important, and it's to do with carbon dioxide. As you probably know, carbon dioxide is what's called a greenhouse gas. And we do need a certain amount of carbon dioxide in our atmosphere, because if we didn't, all the heat from the sun would just disappear off the planet and we'd end up quite cold. So we need a certain amount of carbon dioxide. But if the amount of carbon dioxide starts to increase, then the actual amount of heat trapped in the atmosphere increases. And that means that we end up with the Earth's temperature rising and rising, what we call climate change. And where does all this carbon dioxide come from? Well, it comes from our breathing. Both plants and animals breathe. And it also comes from things that have died and are starting to decay. But the really difficult thing is it comes from combustion. The more energy we use for anything from a television to a car that uses coal or gas to make the electricity, then the more carbon dioxide is put into the atmosphere. As the carbon dioxide increases, so our atmosphere temperature increases. And trees absorb carbon dioxide and they can store it as carbon. And they do this when they photosynthesize. That is, they make their food. So they use water and they use carbon dioxide to make their own food. And that is stored as carbon within the tree. And what you can do is you can actually calculate how much carbon is stored inside your local street trees, or one in your garden, or one in your local park, or maybe even one in your school grounds. And to be able to do that, you will need to measure it. You'll need to measure what's called the circumference, that's around the trunk. And here's Joe to show you how.
Hi, I'm Joe from Suntrap, and I'm going to show you how to measure the circumference of a tree. The only equipment you'll need really is a 1 meter tape, or if you don't have one of those, you can use a piece of string. And all we've done here is we've just tied knots on the string every 10 centimeters. We've just measured these using a regular ruler. You could even do this with a pen or a piece of tape every 10 centimeters. When you found your tree, we found a nice street tree here, you want to make sure that to measure the tree you don't have to step into the road. So just make sure that if it is next to the road, that you don't have to walk onto it. First step, get your tape and find a point on the tree about 1 meter up the trunk. Found a nice spot here. We do have a bit of a knot which makes the tree look wider, so I'm just going to measure just slightly above that where it's the average circumference. I'm going to throw my tape measure around the tree, and you'll notice because the tree's circumference is bigger than a meter, my tape doesn't reach. So what you'll need to do is mark a point on the tree of where your measurements start. You can use something like chalk, or I'm going to actually use a leaf. So find a leaf on the ground, and I'm going to find a point where I want to start my measurement. Now this ash tree has some nice fissures in the bark, so I'm just going to find a fissure that I can push a leaf into. That's where I'll start the measurement. And using my finger, I'm going to mark on the tree trunk where that measurement ends, so I know that's the 1 meter point. All I need to do now is measure between my leaf and my fingertip and add that to 1 meter. And that comes up at about 60 centimeters, so the total is 1 meter 60 centimeters. But you could use the string instead. Find on the 2 meter string where the knots end, just count the number of knots, and that will tell us the measurement.
So now we've measured our tree, we can work out how old it is. The ash tree that Joe's just measured had a circumference of 160 centimetres. And ash trees grow at about 2.5 centimetres per year. So if we divide 160 by 2.5, we find out that Joe's ash tree was about 64 years old. And that meant that it germinated in 1956. Sounds a long time ago, doesn't it? Next, we can find out how much carbon a tree stores. And this time we're going to use a different example. We're going to use the example of an oak tree with a circumference of 200 centimetres. And that oak tree would be about 100 years old. The first thing to do is to look at our table and find out what the dry weight of that tree would be. And that would be the weight of the tree with all the water in it taken out. So the dry weight of an oak tree with a circumference of 200 centimetres would be approximately 4,221 kilograms. Of that amount, about half is carbon. So if we divided that much, 4,221 by 2, we find out how much carbon is inside that oak tree. There would be 2,110 kilograms of carbon. We've not quite finished yet because we want to find out how much carbon dioxide that tree has absorbed during its lifetime, during the 100 years it's been alive. And we can do that by multiplying that final figure we have above by 3.67. And don't worry, we've done the calculation for you. So the amount of carbon dioxide stored and absorbed by an oak tree of 100 years old would be 7,745 kilograms, which is nearly 8 tonnes of carbon dioxide stored in that one tree. That sounds a massive amount, doesn't it? The sad news is that unfortunately, each person in the United Kingdom, on average, uses 11 tonnes of carbon dioxide every year through all the things that we do in our lives. And so even in a tree that is 100 years old, it hasn't even absorbed all the carbon dioxide that we've given out in just 1 year of our lives. So we need to do more than just look after trees. What else can you do? Here are some easy ways to reduce the amount of carbon that you use. First thing is to switch things off, lights, televisions, other things when you're not using them. How about doing a little bit more walking, even in the rain? Leave the car at home and walk to school. We can try and reduce the amount of meat that we eat, especially beef and lamb. The more plants in our diet, the less carbon there will be released into the atmosphere. Make sure you recycle as much as you can, but even better than recycling, of course, is reusing. Have you got a water bottle that you take to school every day? And if you have packed lunch, have you got a reusable packed lunch? A really easy one is to turn the tap off when you're brushing your teeth. The water that we use every day uses lots of energy to make sure it's clean. So the less we use, the less carbon there will be in the atmosphere. Try buying second hand sometimes, not always wanting new. And a really fun thing to do is to try growing your own vegetables, and that will help to reduce your carbon footprint. I want to finish off by sharing with you our vision for the future. And we want to see a world where all trees are valued and cared for, not just in woodlands and forests, like where I work, but also in our towns and cities. And we'd like you to make a pledge to look after and protect your local trees. One way to be able to do this is to become a volunteer tree warden. And you can contact the Tree Council, look at their website to find out how to go about this. And your local area will have a local tree officer. Why not try and contact them and invite them to your school to give you a talk about local trees and what you can do to help look after them. There are other things you could do. Find out which trees in your area have a tree preservation order on them and work with your local community to help protect them. There's an amazing map that you can use in London to find out and look up all about your local street trees. And you can even find out, are there any ancient trees in your area? The Woodland Trust's website is good for this one. What we call for is that both national and local governments plant more trees in urban areas and ensure that our local trees are protected into the future. Because local street trees really are a breath of fresh air and need to be looked after. And whatever you do to find out about your local trees or help look after them, please share what you've done with us on our social media. Hope you've enjoyed this talk and thanks for watching.